Morning, Mark.
Hey guys, I turned it on.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Mike Hill, and I'm with Total Control Health Plans and Coldbrook Insurance. And I'd like to just say a big welcome and thank you to you for joining us this morning for what I know is going to be a fantastic conversation. We've got a great lineup of speakers for you this morning. And to kick things off, I'd like to introduce my co-host, Ben Connor with Connor Insurance. Over the last 3 or 4 years, he's become a great friend of mine. And I'd like to give you a little background on who Ben is and why I'm so honored to call him a friend. Ben has been the CEO of Connor Insurance since 2013, and in 2015, he and his partners bought Connor Insurance from the previous owners. And through his guidance and focus on workplace culture, since that time, Connor Insurance was recognized as one of the 100 healthiest workplaces in America in 2014, 15, 16, and 17. And you'll notice a trend here as I continue to go through his bio. Connor Insurance was also named the healthiest employer in Indiana in 2016 and was a finalist in 2012, 14, and 15. Additionally, Connor Insurance was a top 10 finalist for the best places to work in Indiana in 2014, 15, 16, and 2020. Ben has been recognized by Benefits Pro magazine as a finalist for the 2020 Broker of the Year Award. And in 2019, Employee Benefit Advisor recognized him as a rising star in advising. And both of these are national awards programs for advisors who are making a difference in the benefit advising field. Lastly, Ben was recognized just this year in 2021 by the Indianapolis Business Journal as a 40 under 40 recipient. So Ben is an all-star and going to be a panelist with us this morning, and I'm just honored to co-host this with him. So Ben, welcome to the conversation.
Yeah, Mike, thanks for having me, and just very thankful to be doing this in conjunction with you and your team as well. And I don't have the statistics in front of me, but I do know I could read back the same accolades about you, especially as you've been recently recognized as the 2021 Broker of the Year finalist with Benefits Pro, which that's a remarkable honor. So congrats to you. I think when we look at this topic, why I'm so excited to be here today, especially with our panel of distinguished guests, there's a lot of conversation right now about really the post-pandemic economy, which could be financial as well as workplace. We also have all of our personal experiences of how difficult it can be to recruit and retain in this season of life. But I think what I'm most excited about today, Mike, is the opportunity for us to try to cut through the noise and really establish some takeaways for what should we expect in the short and the short run and the long run as we come out of just the most wild 18 months of probably everyone on this call's lifetime, barring any personal circumstances, certainly. So I think that this is timely, and I'm really just excited to hear what our guests have to say.
Awesome. Well, I love to talk to business owners and ask them what their keys to success were. And more often than not, I hear surround yourself with people smarter than you. And as you'll hear as we do the introductions today, this panel is certainly a group of people way smarter than me. And so just to kind of give everybody an overview of our agenda this morning, I'm going to introduce Dr. Gabe Ehrlich from the University of Michigan and tell you a little bit about him. And he's going to give us an economic forecast. And the reason we think this is such an important part of the conversation is that as we talk about strategies employers can use to reduce employee turnover and increase retention, we also need to think about how long is this new normal going to last, or is it in fact actually a new normal? And so Dr. Ehrlich will give us an overview of that. Then we'll be joined by Kara Soletto from Magnet Culture, who is a fantastic expert on employee retention. And as she shared with me, and if she doesn't mention it, I'll mention it, one of her key tactics on working with managers and what she hopes to help them do. And then finally, we're going to bring you, Ben, back along with Mark Ferrara from the Walt Disney Company to have a panel conversation. So really excited to get started. And so without further ado, let me give you all a little bit more background on Dr. Gabe Ehrlich and why we're so honored to have him with us today. He is an economic forecaster at the University of Michigan, where he's the director of the university's research seminar in quantitative economics. Right there, you should know he's way smarter than me. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Michigan. His work has been discussed in The Economist, the Financial Times, and the Washington Post, and he has recently published articles in the New England Journal of Medicine, the Review of Economics and Statistics, the Journal of Urban Economics, and the Journal of Health Politics, Policy, and Law. Dr. Ehrlich oversees the research seminars forecasts of the US and Michigan economies, and he presents regularly to the Michigan legislature and governor on Michigan's fiscal and economic prospects. He is a co-author recently of the US Economic Outlook for 2020 and 2021, the Michigan Economic Outlook for 2020 and 2021, and the Detroit Economic Outlook for 2019 to 2024. Prior to joining the research seminar, Dr. Ehrlich worked in the financial analysis division at the Congressional Budget Office, where he forecasted interest rates and conducted analysis on monetary policy and the mortgage finance system. So Dr. Ehrlich, thank you so much for joining us today. One little housekeeping item I'd like to share with all of our attendees is that if anything that Gabe says or Kara, Mark, Ben, myself, please feel free to comment in the comments in the chat section. And if you have a question for Gabe, please feel free to post it in the chat section as well, and I'll pop on and interrupt him as he's going, because once we wind him up, it's hard to stop. So Gabe, with that, I'll invite you to share your slides and turn it over to you.
Great. Well, Mike, thanks so much for inviting me to be here today. I'm really looking forward to the event and the discussion, and thanks for the kind introduction as well. So as Mike said, I would love to be interrupted. Keeps things lively, but I'll just jump right in to keep things moving and get to the good stuff. So what I wanted to do, Mike said I'll be sharing a forecast, but I'm actually going to spend most of my time today talking about what the data says right now and where the labor market is today. And then I'll end by talking briefly about our outlook for the next few years. So I'll just jump right in, and I'll show you the current data. So this is the national payroll employment count. So this is wage and salary employment at a monthly frequency for starting in 2005 and through the latest data. We lost about 22.5 million jobs at the start of the pandemic. And through June, we've regained about 15.5 million of those jobs that we lost. So about 70% of the job losses at the start of the pandemic have been recovered. We're averaging about 540,000 job gains per month this year. And so if you were just to extrapolate that pace out, it would take just over a year to get back to the to the pre-pandemic employment level if we maintained that pace. And that'll be a tough ask. But that's the extrapolation if you look. So turning now to unemployment, this slide shows the U3 and U6 unemployment rates. U3 is the headline unemployment rate, so that's what you hear people talk about when they say the unemployment rate. The U6 unemployment rate or underemployment rate is an expanded definition that includes people, for instance, who are working part-time, but say they'd like to work full-time if the hours were available. You can see, so looking at the blue line here for the U3 unemployment, it shot up to 14.8% in April 2020. The U3 unemployment rate shot up almost to 23%. If you look now in the latest data as of June 2021, I should say, the headline unemployment rate is back down to 5.9%, and the U6 unemployment rate is just under 10%, 9.8%. That's good progress, but headline unemployment, if you look, was running actually below 4% before the pandemic, and the U6 unemployment rate was running about 7%. So, in that sense, the unemployment rate is telling the same story as the payroll job count. We've made a lot of progress in recovering from the pandemic, but there's actually still quite a bit of progress left to be made. So we're not recovered yet. One reason that the unemployment rate has fallen so quickly is that the labor force participation rate plummeted in the pandemic. And so just as a statistical note, you have to be in the labor force to be counted as unemployed. So if you're not working, you need to be looking for a job actively. And if you say you're not looking for a job, then you don't count as unemployed, even if in principle you would like to be working. And so when you see the labor force participation rate fall like this, that puts downward pressure on the unemployment rate that can mask weakness in the labor market. And you can see the labor force participation rate fell from nearly 63.5% just before the pandemic to just above 60% at the start of the pandemic. It's running around 61.5% now. So it's actually recovered not quite half of the ground that it lost. So labor force participation does remain depressed. I'm not going to spend too long looking at unemployment insurance claims, but I will show them to you. The claims data is quite noisy. So this slide shows initial weekly unemployment insurance claims from the beginning of last year through the beginning of July. So this is new claims from people who report being newly unemployed. The blue bars show normal unemployment claims, and the yellow bars show the so-called PUA, or pandemic unemployment assistance claims, which are for the self-employed and other people who would not be normally eligible for unemployment. It's really incredible when you look at this. The unemployment before the pandemic, initial unemployment insurance claims were running somewhere in the ballpark of 200,000 to 250,000 per week. And then we had about 25 million total claims in the first 5 weeks of the pandemic's first big wave. And what you can see here is there's actually been a lot of progress on initial unemployment insurance claims. They're now they're running about 500,000 per week. That is still above the level from before the pandemic, but it's very encouraging. And we have reason to believe that filing rates are up. So even though unemployment insurance claims and initial unemployment insurance claims are running higher than they were before the pandemic, we think partly that's because more people who are laid off or who become unemployed are filing. It's not necessarily that more people are being laid off. Again, this data is noisy though. The news is not quite as encouraging for continued unemployment insurance claims, which is what this graph shows. I won't bore you too much with the various types of claims, but we've stacked them up here. The key point to make is that continued unemployment insurance claims rocketed from about 2 million just before the pandemic up to above 30 million at the height of the crisis. And when you add all of the programs together, continued unemployment insurance claims right now are running about 14 million in the latest data. So just to summarize the story with unemployment insurance claims is that new claims, so people coming into the system, are way down, but continued claims are still pretty highly elevated relative to before the pandemic.
So Gabe, a question for you. One of the things we hear a lot about is the continued unemployment benefits and number one, the need for them, but also their effect on an individual's willingness to work. So do you believe that the numbers here in red, or the bars in red, are really having an impact on somebody's willingness to go back to work potentially?
So Mike, and I should say, one thing this chart doesn't really speak to is the extra $300 a week. So there are a lot of different unemployment insurance programs that have been put in place in the pandemic. Eligibility is way up. It's easier to qualify for unemployment insurance, and also the generosity of benefits is up during the pandemic, and that's set to expire on Labor Day. What I would say is, listen, the unemployment insurance is a part of the story. It's one of several factors. I do think there are a number of factors at work. We do have states that are now opting out of various supplemental unemployment insurance programs. The extra $300 per week, and the extended benefits. We're not seeing right now, so far, it's very early on. You don't see a big jump in employment in those states. So to me, that says, this certainly can't be, the only force behind what's happening in the labor market, or even, in my opinion, the dominant force. When you think about the pandemic, I personally believe, there are still lingering disruptions in people's routines and their childcare. And I actually think there's still pandemic reluctance. So if you think about, working in sectors where you do a lot of face-to-face interaction with people who might be vaccinated, might not be vaccinated, you might still see people, feeling reluctant because of the pandemic. That being said, I do think it is a factor in what's happening right now in the labor market. So I think that, unfortunately, that's as precise as we can be. People want a really clean answer on this. One thing to point out is it's hard to get a super clean answer to, what comes from government programs what comes from individual decisions. And we saw this earlier in the pandemic with restrictions, because to some extent government policy responds to what's happening in the with the pandemic itself in various states and locations. So anyways,
Thank you for that.
sure thing. Yeah, Mike, it's a great question, and of course it's on people's minds. I do want to move to labor demand now. So this chart shows job postings from Indeed.com, and this shows labor demand really being sky high right now. So this is indexed to February of 2020, so before the pandemic, and you can see that job postings fell by about 40% last spring, but they've really recovered quite remarkably since then. They rose back above the pre-pandemic level early this year, and actually in the latest data, they're almost 35% higher than they were before the pandemic. So that's on the one hand. I have to caution you, not all of the data sources tell the same story. So this slide shows job postings from Burning Glass, which is another aggregator of job postings. This data is choppy, but it's not telling exactly the same story as the Indeed data. So this is kind of on the other hand slide. So let me go back. So this is Indeed, and it's, you can see it's a smooth series, and it's jumping up right now. The Indeed data was showing labor demand rising through early May. It has fallen in the most recent data, and it's actually tracking a little bit below where it was before the pandemic right now. My personal inclination is to trust the Indeed data a little bit more than the Burning Glass data, but I did feel obligated to show you this slide just to say not all of the data is unanimous right now. This slide shows data on job openings from the Bureau of Labor Statistics job openings and labor turnover survey, or the so-called JOLTS data. That's in the blue line, and then in the yellow line is the count of unemployed persons. And you can see potentially that the blue line ends a little before the yellow line. The job openings data does lag a tiny bit behind some of the other data. I want to draw your attention first just to the blue line, which is job openings. The BLS data is consistent with the Indeed data. It shows a spike in job openings right now to above 9 million in May, from about 7 million job postings to start the year. And what I really want to draw your attention to in this chart is how different the pandemic and the recovery from the pandemic has been than the recovery from the Great Recession. So if you look in 2009, there were about 6 unemployed people, so that's the yellow line, for every job opening. There were way more unemployed people than job openings. Right now, when you look, the number of unemployed people and the number of job openings is just about equal. So they're both elevated. We have a lot of job openings. We also have a lot of unemployed people. But that's very different from what you saw coming out of the Great Recession, when there were a lot more unemployed people than job openings. If you look at people leaving jobs, you can really decompose what we would call separations into 2 things. One is quits, so that's people leaving jobs voluntarily, and that's in the blue line on this chart. And then the other is what you would call layoffs and discharges. So this is involuntary separations. It's you lost your job when you didn't want to, right? There was a spike in layoffs. It really dominates the graph during the pandemic. But you can see layoffs have actually fallen quite sharply since then. Right now, they're at their all-time low in the data. This data series only goes back to December of 2000. But still, layoffs and involuntary separations are at their all-time low in the data. Whereas if you look at quits, they're actually up quite a bit. They were at their all-time high in this data in April of this year. So, the basic takeaway is if you manage to hold on to your job during the pandemic, your odds of losing your job voluntarily right now are pretty low. But as an employer, which, I know everybody on this webinar is an employer, your odds of holding on to your employees right now are not as high as they would have been before the pandemic, right? So it's interesting times, obviously, in the labor market. And then finally, for this section of my slides, this slide shows the number of hires per job opening, per measured job opening. And so it's not just people's imagination. It really is getting harder to fill positions. You can see that hires per job opening has been on a steady downward trend since the Great Recession. In the Great Recession, there were many more hires than official job openings, about 1.7 times actually as many hires as posted openings. That ratio fell steadily during the recovery from the Great Recession. And we got to the point where there were actually, there were more, every official job opening was yielding less than 1 hire, is the way to say it. as we recovered from the Great Recession, there was a little bit of whiplash during the pandemic because hires plunged initially, but now we're back to rock bottom, and every job opening is producing less than 2/3 of a hire. Again, this is the lowest level in the history of this series. So it's not just your imagination, it's really getting harder to fill openings in the data. So that's what you might call the quantity side of the labor market. How many people are employed, what's happening to job openings. I think the other side of the labor market is what's happening to wages, right? What's happening to the price side of the equation. I'm sure it's not going to surprise anyone when I say that wages have jumped during the pandemic. But there's a lot of nuance around that I want to discuss. So this graph shows average hourly private earnings. They were running a little bit below $24 an hour before the pandemic, and that's averaged over the whole private economy. And they've jumped up actually to about $25.70 right now. But I want to make 2 points about this series. The first one is when you adjust this for inflation, it's not as pronounced, okay? Compensation isn't doing as much when you adjust for inflation because inflation has picked up in the pandemic. And then the second point I want to make, which is really important nuance about this graph, is that a big part of this jump is really a composition effect. Lower wage workers have been much more likely to lose their jobs and to remain unemployed during the pandemic than higher wage workers. And that composition effect will boost average wages for people who are working, even if everybody who's still working right now is receiving basically the same wage as they were before the pandemic, right? And so if you look at job gains, wage gains among individuals who kind of have remained employed, they're not as impressive as this graph. So those are the 2 caveats to this graph. So just to start with inflation, headline CPI inflation has spiked as the economy has reopened from below 2% in most of 2019 and 2020 to 5.3% year over year in June. I could give an entire talk on inflation. I'm not going to bore you today, but a lot of the spike in inflation is due to supply bottlenecks, the rebound in energy prices, and other reopening effects from the pandemic. But even so, if you look at so-called core CPI inflation, which strips out food and energy prices, that has also started to rise recently. It's at about 4.5% in the latest data. Yeah, Mike.
So thanks for taking a break there, Gabe. So and maybe you're going to get to this, but I think this is an important piece. All the professionals are saying that they anticipate inflation to go back down, that this is a blip and it's not going to last. But if it does last, then employers need to seriously rethink their compensation strategies. Is that fair?
I do, Mike. I think that is fair. I'm not an HR expert, so I don't want to, give advice to the professionals. But yeah, our view is that a lot of this is going to turn out to be transient. That inflation is going to moderate as we move forward. I do want to say, the period coming out of the Great Recession and in the recovery was a period of unusually low inflation by long-term historical standards. We do expect inflation to run somewhat higher as we move, over the next few years than it was before the pandemic, but not like we're seeing right now, right? And to your point, I do think there's a lot of uncertainty around the inflation outlook. Certainly, the spike in inflation has been bigger than people expected. People did expect some pickup in inflation, especially just with the energy prices rising and things like that. So I think to your point, that's exactly right. That people need to be keeping an eye on this.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. Yeah. So the first point to make here is what I've done just to back up here. I've taken this graph and I've just adjusted it for inflation in this graph here. And when you adjust average earnings for inflation, they don't look nearly as far out of line as when you don't adjust for inflation. And in fact, you could argue, look, you could fit a lot of different rulers to this graph and ask, well, okay, what's the long-term trend? But you could make the argument that inflation-adjusted wages are pretty close to the pre-pandemic trend at this point. It depends how you squint at the graph. Coming back to the second kind of caveat or the point of nuance I made about average earnings right now, this chart shows median wage growth for individual workers. So this tracks individual workers over time from the Atlanta Fed's wage tracker. And the purpose of doing this is that it avoids the composition effects that you get when you just take an average across all workers who remain employed. Okay, so this is, again, it's looking at the median wage change within individuals. So people who have basically stayed employed over a year. And by this metric, wage growth has been pretty steady during the pandemic. You could argue that it's even slowed down a little from just before the pandemic. I wouldn't read too much into that, but I would say this is a picture of pretty steady wage growth when you strip out those composition effects. This slide splits out wage growth into four wage quartiles. So this splits workers into four groups by their earnings. The first quartile in the blue line here is the low wage workers, the lowest wage workers. And what you can see is following the Great Recession, in the initial part of the recovery from the Great Recession, low wage workers experienced the slowest wage growth for a number of years. But wage growth at the bottom end of the wage distribution really started picking up in 2014 and 2015. And then as we got out of 2015, and you know, it's been a number of years now, wage growth at the bottom end of the distribution has actually been the fastest. So wage growth in that first quartile has been faster than wage growth at the top of the wage distribution. And that trend has not reversed during the pandemic. Okay, so that's what the incoming data show. And what I'll do now is I'll talk briefly about our forecast. And then I'm looking forward to the other talk and the panel discussion. So this slide shows my group's forecast for payroll employment. We're expecting about 700,000 job gains per month in the third quarter of this year as the economy continues to reopen, and about 600,000 job gains per month in the fourth quarter. We do expect job gains to slow down as we get into next year, but we still expect an average of about 275,000 job gains per month in 2022. Payroll employment surpasses its pre-pandemic peak in the fourth quarter of next year in our forecast. And we expect a decent growth in 2023 as well. So you can see it's a pretty aggressive recovery, but what we don't expect is to get onto this pre-pandemic trend by the end of our forecast. So if you were just to extrapolate out, okay, well, where were we headed before the pandemic? You can see we're not getting back onto the trend, but we are getting back up above where we were in our forecast. Similarly, we expect the unemployment rate to keep falling with a little bit of a pause. You can see a little bit of a pause here in the second half of this year. That's related to our expectations for a rebound in labor force participation, and I'll show you that on the next slide. So as people re-enter the labor force, that's going to kind of put upward pressure on the unemployment rate. But you can see we expect the unemployment rate to get down to just about 4%, just a little bit above 4% by the end of 2023. That would be great progress. That really is a strong recovery. And you can see how much more quickly the unemployment rate has fallen than it did following the Great Recession. I do, again, I've got to give you the caveat. On the other hand, unemployment averaged 3.6% in the fourth quarter of 2019. So again, we're not seeing a full recovery in our forecast by 2023. This slide shows our forecast for the labor force participation rate. And we're expecting participation to rise from about 61.6% in the second quarter of this year to about 62.4% by the fourth quarter of this year. As schools reopen, vaccines continue to roll out, and the extra unemployment insurance benefits end. I do want to point out this forecast was finalized before the Delta variant really picked up the way it has most recently. Of course, that throws uncertainty into the outlook. Moving forward, we expect the labor force participation rate to climb more slowly over the next 2 years in 2022 and 2023, getting up to about 62.9% by the end of 2023. Again, that's a solid recovery, but it does leave us a little bit short of where we were before the pandemic. And last, I'm going to talk about our forecast for compensation growth. So our preferred forecast metric in our forecasting model is the Bureau of Labor Statistics index of private non-farm business compensation per hour. That data does lag a little bit. It's only available through the first quarter of 2021 right now. It rose 5.8% year over year in the first quarter. We do expect it to slow down in the second quarter data when you look in year over year growth terms. Again, because lower wage workers have been re-entering the workforce, and that puts downward pressure on the overall average wage level. So again, this slowdown that you see in our forecast is a composition effect. We expect compensation growth then to pick up over the rest of our forecast as those composition effects work their way through the system and start to fade. And we see compensation growth picking up to 3% by the end of this year and nudging up to above 4% by the end of 2023. That's pretty good compensation growth. You can see if you were to really take an average, that's decent growth over time, but it's not a historical anomaly by any stretch of the imagination. And finally, I do want to just adjust that forecast for inflation, and it looks a little less impressive when you account for inflation. Again, we estimate that actually because inflation's been spiking recently, average real compensation has been falling right now. Again, that's averaged over all workers. So as you see more low-wage workers enter the labor market, that puts a downward pressure on average compensation. And then when you adjust for inflation, it actually turns out that our forecast of real compensation economy-wide is falling. We don't expect that to last. And in large part, that's because we expect the current spike in inflation, as Mike was discussing, to moderate soon. And so we see growth in average real compensation per hour climbing to just under 2% by the end of our forecast period. And again, you can see that's pretty good growth historically, but it's not off the charts growth. And so when you listen to some of the commentary about the labor market, you might think, wow, wages are really taking off. This is, it's an incredible time for compensation. The data is a little more nuanced than that. So again, not to say that we haven't seen a spike in average earnings, we have, but you've got to take it with a little bit of nuance and caveats. So just to sum up, we are going through a time of major change in the labor market right now. It has been a wild time to be an economic forecaster. We have high job openings that are coinciding with a high number of unemployed workers. So there's really a lot of churn in the labor market. There's lots of turnover right now. Wages jumped during the pandemic, but as I've mentioned, that was a composition effect primarily. If you look at individual workers, they haven't been receiving big raises, at least without switching jobs. We do expect employment to get back up to where it was before the pandemic by the second half of 2022. And we expect compensation growth to be strong, to be pretty healthy, but to remain contained. So with that, thanks very much. And I'm looking forward to the rest of the panel.
Gabe, thank you very much. I've got just a couple follow-up questions for you. So first, one of our attendees was asking, can you just give us a general sense of the primary drivers of the inflation that we're experiencing today?
Yeah, so one thing that is really remarkable is that inflation has been very divergent across sectors. So you see it in the energy prices, and actually, being in Michigan, something we pay attention to a lot. Actually, a lot of the inflation you're seeing is coming from used vehicle prices, so used car and truck prices. I think that frankly, the auto manufacturers made a miscalculation at the start of the pandemic. They expected vehicle demand to be a lot weaker for a lot longer than it's turned out to be. You hear about these microchip shortages. That's something we pay a lot of attention to here in Michigan. That is definitely constraining new vehicle inventories. That's spilling over into the used vehicle market. It turns out just if you mechanically decompose inflation, a big part of the spike we're seeing right now in inflation is from used vehicle prices. You also see it, you hear these stories about lumber and other commodities. I should say those prices have peaked, and we've actually seen price declines in some of the commodities right now. And finally, you do see it some in kind of what you might think of as reopening related sectors. So things like hotels and business travel related things. So where you're seeing, you might think of as reopening pains in the economy. If, now listen, people, these are old war stories from before my time, but if you look back to the 1970s, you could always find an economist who would tell you, oh, yeah, inflation is running 10%, but if you strip out this price, you strip out that price, it turns out inflation is only 3%. So there's no need to worry. I don't want to be that guy, okay? Look, it is true that inflation is rising right now, but I do think if you really look at core prices and prices that are not affected in particular by the pandemic, they have been a lot steadier. So we do think that a lot of the inflation we're seeing is transitory right now, and inflation will be coming back down. Again, that said, we don't expect it to come back down to the levels that we saw from the Great Recession to the pandemic. That was a period of historically low inflation.
Perfect. Two other brief questions for you. So when you're looking at the compensation gains, and we're actually going to be seeing that go down in the latter half of 2021, one of the strategies that we see employers using right now to get employees to join the team is a signing bonus or some sort of little kicker like that. Is that type of activity reflected in your data, or is that a side note and you're just looking at base wages in those charts?
Look, most of the charts I was showing you are base wages. It's harder, the wage data that we have especially the high frequency data, is not as good as you'd like. I thought about adding some charts from ADP, for instance, that has a wage tracker. I cut those, for time. So yeah, Mike, I mean, just from a data perspective, most of that is base wages. Absolutely, you hear this about the bonuses. And if you look at, for instance, wage changes for job switchers, they are certainly running higher than those overall compensation numbers I showed you.
Perfect. Last question from one of our panelists who I'll be welcoming next is from Kara. When we look at those that left the workforce during the pandemic, it was disproportionately women. And so do you anticipate that the rebound is going to be disproportionately, more women are going to be joining the workforce than men? Or do you believe that women as a percentage of the workforce are going to represent a lower percentage moving forward than they did before the pandemic?
My hope is that we will see women regaining, re-entering the labor force, as things settle down from the pandemic. People debate this very much, and you can tell different stories with the numbers. How much of the depressed labor force participation is due to disruptions in childcare? I think early on in the pandemic, that was a big part of it. At this point, it seems like most of that should be behind us. But then you have this question, well, okay, what's going on with labor force participation? Why hasn't it come back up? I do hope that we'll see women, regain the labor force. I really do think that the back to school in the fall is going to be a big, kind of back to normal time. I do think, when you think about Labor Day, it has a lot of kind of focal aspects that, those extra unemployment insurance benefits are set, to run out at Labor Day. It's a back to school season. And so, in many ways that might represent a kind of back to the new normal, if you will. But I think that there are a lot of puzzles out there about labor force participation that people will be studying for years to come. Another thing to point out is it looks like the pandemic has pulled retirements forward. So some of that decline in the labor force participation rate is, if you were 65 and you might have been planning to work 1 or 2 more years, you might have thought, what, this is as good a time to retire as any. So those people, it's quite possible are not going to come back in. So that's part of why we don't see the labor force participation rate, getting back up to where it was before the pandemic.
Awesome. Gabe, thank you so much for your remarks. We look forward to having you back for our panel discussion. And at this time, I'm going to make a transition and introduce our next speaker. And one of the things that really struck me with Gabe's conversation is that less than 2/3 of job hires or job openings result in a hire. And so what that tells us is that the easiest employee to hire is the one that you already have. And that's why I'm really excited to introduce Kara Soletto to you. She is a workforce thought leader and works with organizations of all sizes to reduce unnecessary employee turnover by bridging generational gaps and making managers more effective in their roles. As a millennial herself, Kara knows firsthand what it's like to have a heightened sense of entitlement, very little employee loyalty, and a dependency on her smartphone. However, unlike most millennials, Kara's figured out how to exactly how those attributes were cultivated during her formative years, and she now shares this story with leaders across the country, including teams at Toyota, UPS, Cintas, and Humana, to name a few. Recently, Workforce Magazine in Chicago named Kara a game changer for her innovative approach to solving generational issues in the workplace, and Recruiter.com listed her in their top 10 company culture experts to watch list. Today, at 39, she's a highly sought after national speaker conducting 50 to 100 engagements annually. We're honored she's with us for one of those. And she's already earned her certified speaking professional designation, which less than 10% of speakers achieve. Louisville Business First named her one of their 2018 40 Under 40. And she's also the author of the book Staying Power, Why Your Employees Leave and How to Keep Them Longer. And most recently, how we discovered Kara is that she was recently featured in the article Turnover Tsunami in the summer issue of HR Magazine with SHRM. So Kara, we are thrilled to have you with us, and I'm going to turn over to you to share your thoughts on how we can keep the employees we have.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mike. Welcome to a little bit different conversation than what Dr. Ehrlich was doing. I am much more of a storyteller versus you won't see a whole lot of data and charts on my slides here, because I'm talking with senior leaders and executives and management and directors about what really keeps your people. And even before the pandemic, I was having conversations about the difficulty and the challenges of keeping people. We saw this coming even 10 years ago, and now my organization focuses solely on how to keep people longer. That's what we're focused on, and I wanted to talk about today. So one of the pieces is really evaluating, why would people stay at your organization? What is that carrot on a stick or multiple carrots that you have for folks, especially because most leaders I talked to for the last 5 years or so, they had been budgeting about 2 to 3% for pay increases, maybe 4% for the top performers, but oftentimes they're pulling that 4% by taking somebody else down to 1% and still averaging out 2 to 3%, which, as we know from the charts you just saw, and just from our history here, we know that that's barely a cost of living adjustment in many markets. And this year in particular, we're seeing a housing boom as well, which then causes rent prices to go up. So the workers then feel pretty slighted, because here they put in their year of work, and what do they get for it? A 2% raise, 2.5% raise, people call it, but that's not a raise. They cannot get anything beyond the bread, milk, and eggs that they bought last year because their rent just went up and sucked up any of that cost of living adjustment that came in. So that's another huge reason that even pre-pandemic and certainly moving forward, that we're seeing a lot of people job hop, because they can get a 5 to 10% increase shifting jobs. And now we just have a very different employer-employee relationship, which I will address as well. So I wanted to share with you another story and example for you, because years ago, I remember being at a gas pump, and I pulled up and put my credit card in, waiting for authorization, and then grabbed the nozzle, put it in my car, did that little set it and forget it click thingy. I'm just standing there waiting. And another gentleman pulls up on the same pump the other side. Well, he walked into the convenience store, quickly walked back to his car, puts the nozzle in, and I'm talking seconds, not a minute or two. Within seconds, his nozzle clicked off. And this gentleman just lost it, okay? He started screaming, not at me, but at the world. 2.5 gallons? 2.5 gallons is all I can get? Well, that's all the gas money I have this week. So there is no way I can get to and from work and get everything I need on 2.5 gallons. Well, that was a huge eye-opener for me, friends, because here I was just filling my tank. And honestly, I hadn't even noticed that the price of gas had been climbing. And this guy was immensely impacted by that price of gas for the week. And then, if you think about it, had to sacrifice elsewhere. If he needed more gas, he was going to have to pull those dollars for somewhere else. So I find that there are kind of 3 different folks in our workforce today, and even of ourselves. And one of those is, there's a group of folks like me, admittedly, where I just pop in my credit card and I'm going to fill my tank. I don't really care what the price is. I just got to fill my tank and move on for the day. Now, a lot of folks also fall into this second one, as I've been talking to my friends and family, and I say, do you care about the price of gas? Do you even look at the price of gas? And most of them said to me, well, I'll compare 2 stations and go to the cheaper one, or I might even drive a couple miles outside of town because I know that's cheaper, right? And then they'll fill up their tank where they think it would be a cheaper station. But then there's a huge chunk of our workforce as well, particularly if you are hiring lower wage workers, or folks, lots of people are living at or even beyond their means at this point. And so there's this third group here as well of folks who pay inside, and they have a set dollar amount, whether that is $10, $20, $30, $40 for gas at that particular fill up. And that is it, my friends. That's all they have. Okay. And so they're going to have to pull from those other areas. So my point in telling this, and when I share this type of story with leadership teams, it's all about, do you know your people? Do you really know what keeps them up at night? Do you really know where their money is going and what their priorities are? We also see a lot of low-wage workers, for example, that don't want a raise because then they fall off the benefits cliff of maybe some housing subsidies or other childcare support and other help that they have to live and make ends meet. So we have this really interesting situation of a lot of our managers are somewhat disconnected from today's front line. Okay, so think about the many types of disconnect that we're continuing to see here. I speak a lot on generations. So there's certainly a generational disconnect of what the employer-employee relationship has been and should be according to different folks. Wages, whether we're lower wage or higher wage, we tend to then start having more of a socioeconomic disconnect in our lives and our priorities, where we spend money, for example. We also have a flexibility disconnect between hourly and salary workers who can leave at 3 o'clock and who can't for maybe a soccer game or a kid's graduation ceremony or something like that, right? And ultimately, we have this growing disconnect between the access as someone who makes more money, is a salary worker with more flexibility. They tend to have more access to support systems around them, neighbors, family, retired moms and dads that can help out with children if there's a snow day or a sick kiddo, things like that, right? So I just encourage all of us to think about this growing disconnect and ensure that we are staying connected to really understand today's new workforce and to understand our people on many, many levels, okay? So we are seeing a flip of the switch from my perspective in long-term employment is kind of a thing of the past. Much of that is because we don't have long-term benefits like we used to, such as pensions and any other retirement or longer-term promises like that. And just to stop you there, in case there's usually somebody that says, oh, Kara, we still have a pension. No one under 40 believes you. So we can try to use that as a recruiting tool, but because the news tells us that they've been underfunded or new ownership can come in or be privatized or, different things like that, the younger generations are quite skeptical of any of those kind of long-term benefits. So because we're seeing this shift, there is a much different employer-employee relationship today. And I often argue that it has to be mutually beneficial. It must be mutually beneficial on any given day, because if our sales are down, if our occupancy is down, if our numbers are down, whatever your customer metrics are, if your numbers are down, you are very likely to cut staff or cut hours. And I see it over and over where we promise somebody full-time or 30 hours a week or whatnot. But then if our numbers come down, we have to pass that on and cut the hours of our staff. Now, of course, that was mostly before the tremendous short staffness that we're having today. But that has been the historical response and has lost a lot of the trust of our frontline staff, for example, that they just don't trust that the company is going to keep the promises they've made to them. And at the same time, the employees, if they feel at any moment this isn't a fit for me, they can walk away as well. So both the employer and the employee can break that relationship at any moment, in many states for no reason, no cause, right? At will states and whatnot. So today, just keep in mind, it has to remain mutually beneficial. And we have to work at that, just like marriage, right? At any moment, somebody could break that commitment. And so we must keep working on it and keep winning over one another in many cases, okay? Then another one is, I believe it's time to recalibrate our success metrics and the milestones, because if you had somebody who stayed in a position for 20 years in the past, now it's much more likely that new position is going to be more of a 5-year position. So I've seen a lot of organizations banging their head against a wall because they'll say, he was here 3 or 4 years. He was killing it. He was doing amazing. He was on track to make all this money and, be the next leader. And he walked away from that what in the world, but it is a very different situation today that a lot of workers just don't see the benefit of staying long-term. And if they're a rock star at your organization, they're likely going to go somewhere else and be a rock star as well, and may even be able to take those resume credits to get a job that's going to accelerate them faster in that rock star status. So we need to recalibrate what is realistic. For some of my clients, we're looking at 3 to 5 years, and they're wanting to get that to 7, for example. Those are the strategies, versus other of my clients have a lot of 30, 60, 90-day turnover, and they are literally right now just hoping for 6 months. Because keeping someone 6 months is twice as long as 90 days. And that is cutting their turnover in half if they can reach that 6-month mark. Now, ideally, over time, you're going to want to extend that, because we don't want a long-term goal here to be a 6-month employee. But that is the reality for many, many organizations that are playing this low-wage churn game and competition against the locations around them. All right. So what actually keeps people, this is a much deeper and bigger conversation, who is the flight risk, who's not. But I will tell you, a lot of folks have stuck around in organizations not because they love the job and they love what they do and the people they serve and they love the company and things like that. There are people who stay for that reason, and that's great. If you've built a great place to work, that's fabulous. But then when I dive deeper in my workshops about, okay, well, why would the people stay that aren't as happy? There's a lot of golden handcuffs out there. And so what that means is maybe they are in a pension program, or maybe they just have seniority over others. Maybe folks just hate change. They say things like, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. So I'm not going to find another job and learn a new team and new software and a new building. No. I don't really like this place, but I at least know how to navigate it, and I'll just deal with it here. Okay. So I bring this up because, especially as a millennial myself, there's this whole conversation around loyalty and how the younger workers have no loyalty. And yet we sometimes forget to realize that the older workers, I mean, just the more tenured folks who've been there 10, 20, even 30 years, sometimes they're there not because they're loyal and or because they love your company and their job. Some of it is because they hate change. Some of it is because they have golden handcuffs. Okay. There's lots of different reasons that keep people. And we need to be pretty realistic when we talk about why should people work for us. One thing I'm talking a lot with organizational leaders about right now is, how attractive are you really? Okay. Because, for example, if you still have a warehouse or manufacturing that doesn't have air conditioning and you are in a hot summer time right now, that was okay in the past, and people would just come in for their paycheck. And now we're seeing that that is unacceptable for folks when they can go somewhere else in the summer months into an air conditioned position. So just even little things like that of how truly attractive are you as an organization? Because I'll tell you, people can go anywhere and get a paycheck and a crappy boss. Okay, they really can. So if we think about what does keep people, we have found it's not as much of a generational issue as it is that every new hire is a flight risk. Because if you go back to that change conversation, if somebody had the guts to leave their last company and come to you, they absolutely have the guts to leave your organization and go on to the next big thing, because they don't have any roots. They don't have any obligations. Okay. So that's one of the things that we try to work on as well, is how do we grow deeper roots for folks so that it makes them harder to transplant and not want to just get up and go to that next shiny opportunity. Okay. So really focusing on those new hires. I don't care whether she is 25 or 45. She's a very similar flight risk because she left that last organization and is willing to go on to something new. Okay. Now, one of my clients, they really brought to light this assumption of why people quit. And when we asked the managers, it was a ready-mix concrete company, and they were losing all those drivers, right? The spinning trucks. And so we asked the managers, why do people leave? And the managers consistently said two reasons: pay and schedules. That's why people leave. And to their credit, that's what they heard in the exit interviews. That's what people would tell them. I got a better opportunity. It's a better schedule or pay for my family, right? But then when we talked to the drivers, they actually went in a different direction. And the studies, many studies show that people will actually stay and not entertain more money if they are happy where they are, if they feel appreciated and then have a good relationship with their supervisor, their team, things like that. Okay. So yeah, people complain all the time. Oh, it's for 50 cents more an hour. It's for $1,000 more, that type of thing. But then when you actually talk to the employees outside of an exit interview, because oftentimes they're not giving you the full story there, they said there were no staff meetings, no communication. They felt like they were the last to find out everything, especially because they were out in the field, right? Their only connection back to home office was the dispatcher. So that person became a really critical part of the culture there, for example, which those companies hadn't realized how important that dispatcher relationship was, right? They hated outdated hardware and software. That's huge, particularly for younger generations who expect the technology to work and to be there, okay? The bosses were degrading and play favorites. Can't let that happen anywhere. And then this one was particularly interesting to me. They said the truck you get as a rookie is a joke. Well, hello, what did we just identify? The new hires are our greatest flight risk. And yet we often say, well, the new hires need to pay their dues. They need to wait their turn. They need to earn their stripes. And the employment market has shifted, my friends, where the employees and those new hires have the upper hand. So we can't play that pay the dues type of strategy anymore. Otherwise, they are going to continue to job hop because they feel they're not taken seriously and that they're told to kind of sit the bench until it's time for them to bring their greatest value. Okay. So a lot of times I'm working with the leadership team to kind of shift that mindset about how we view the new hires and that employer-employee relationship. Okay. So think about some of those components as well at your organization. Another big factor I'm seeing is we have flattened the hierarchy, which was sexy, right? Let's eliminate positions so everyone's closer to the top. That has come back to haunt us at this point because those frontline leaders and the middle managers, the assistant managers and the assistant directors and folks like that, those positions were the critical wiggle room that we had so that when people left, that person would fill in and help hire and train and mentor and even do the job that person was expected to do. And over the years, we have just crunched, saying we've got to be lean. We've got to do more with less. That's a fluffy layer. We don't need them. The workers can just do their job, and then the managers can just be managers, and focus on their metrics and their expectations, right? Well, over the last 20 to 30 years, we've really crunched that too far. We've kind of swung the pendulum too far, and we need to pull that back because what has happened now, and I know there's a lot of words coming on this next slide. I'm not going through them, but I want to show the amount, the volume of what we have put on managers' plates, because the typical coverage is covering when people are out, making sure that the team has that coverage, performance discussions, regular training, mentoring, team building, and fighting fires, right? Every manager has to do that. Well, now that turnover has gone crazy and we keep flattening the hierarchy, right? Turnover has gone crazy. So now you've got even more people to hire and onboard and terminate, all the paperwork that goes with that too, developing the staff, and or covering that shift. Stay interviews. We highly recommend that you spend time one-on-one with folks so that they don't leave, filling the vacant roles and responsibilities of those folks, then keeping everybody up to date, shifting things around, not to mention fighting more fires. Okay. And then ultimately, where I see a lot of organizations now, their managers aren't even being managers anymore because they're just in the trenches trying to do the job and interviewing people to do the job all the time. So now so many management strategies are missing because they don't have time to seek out threats, to find opportunities. They don't have time to work on business metrics and new strategies and innovation and things like that. Because now we're almost in this death spiral of turnover where we have so much turnover that it's burning out the good people who are saying, I can't take mandatory overtime anymore and I'm out. My spouse is going to leave me, can't do this. So I just want to also bring to light that we really need to take a look at a true hierarchical efficiency and examine whether having done more with less is going to serve us and be more sustainable moving forward or not. Okay. So strategy wise, what do we do about it? I will say that beyond giving managers their role back, meaning let them be managers by giving them more support and more staff to do the jobs so they can come up to a more strategic and supportive level. But also, have you even given the managers the tools to be successful? Do you have leadership development programs in place? Are you doing assessments about behaviors and motivators and emotional intelligence to help them understand this increasingly diverse workforce we have, not just diverse from race, ethnicity, gender, generational, different behavioral styles, different communication channel preferences, all different types of diversity. We teach a lot about diversity of mindset and how you come to work, what that lens looks like personally for you. So have you really helped your managers and supervisors at every level, from executive level all the way to frontline supervisors? Have you helped them understand today's new workforce? Remember the gas station, right? Do they know their people? And are they continuously given the tools to be successful in those roles? Because they could be the reason that you're seeing more and more of the churn. If they are or are letting anyone on their team eat their young, for example, any kind of hazing or that mantra of paying your dues, and they're really pushing people out the door. You may think, oh, but I need that person because they're a subject matter expert, when really that subject matter expert shouldn't be in management. They should be a technical advisor. We need a different path for that person. They should be a technical advisor where someone with better communication and leadership skills would be better at managing the team and the projects, for example. So I will tell you that investing in the management development, those skills and shifting the old school mindset, the because I said so, right? Shifting that mindset over to understanding and retaining today's new workforce, that has been the biggest bang for your buck on reducing turnover, is making it a better place to work by having more effective managers in those roles. And that's where we start to see our clients have that decline and more stability, right? The decline in turnover and more staffing stability to get our quality, our productivity, and ultimately our sustainability as an organization back up to where we need that to be. All right. So with that, I will turn it back over to Mike and the crew. And then, of course, I'm happy to take any questions that have come in or that come in during the panel.
Awesome, Kara. Thank you so much for that great insight. We look forward to picking your brain a little bit more during our panel discussion. And so at this time, I'd like to invite Ben Connor back and Gabe back and introduce our final participant in our panel discussion. We're very fortunate to have Mark Ferrara with us this morning. And just to give you a little background on him and his experience and how he's fully qualified to weigh in on this conversation. He is the executive coaching practice leader for the Walt Disney Company. His work is primarily focused on the systemic management of coaching tools and the relationships external and internal coaches with internal and external coaches globally. Additionally, he coaches senior executives and high potential leaders and is involved in all global strategic HR projects. After 28 years, he retired from Eli Lilly and Company in 2017, the last 8 years of which he was vice president of talent management. Mark was accountable for global employee recruiting, assessment, learning and development, staffing, including succession management, performance management, diversity and inclusion, and HR research. Additionally, he coached senior leaders, facilitated multiple CEO succession transitions, and regularly interacted with the board of directors. His previous human resources roles at Lilly included Senior Director of Compensation and Benefits, Senior Director of Human Resources supporting Lilly Research Laboratories, Director of Global Staffing, and finally, Manager of Succession Management. So Mark has a very diverse and storied career as well. So Mark, we're glad you could join us today. So just to kind of set the conversation as we get started, we've got 4 poll questions that we want to kind of throw out there. And we're going to pop the first one up real quickly. This might seem like a silly question to ask because of the conversation we're already having, but as Gabe alluded to, turnover has happened or increased quite a bit, generally economy-wide. But for the population that we have with us, just be interested if you'd be willing to, as a participant, weigh in and let us know, have you seen an uptick in employee turnover in 2021? I have a speculation on where this may go, but I think it will inform our conversations. So as we do that, we'll give it maybe a couple of, maybe 15, 20 seconds more for that, and then we'll close that out and take a look at the results. Mark, with some conversations that I know you and Ben had, and just to kind of tie the knots here and help folks understand your connection with our group, you and Ben go way back as very high-powered basketball coaches of a pretty impressive league. Is that correct?
Yeah, Ben is sort of the John Wooden of Indianapolis. So
there you go. And how old were your players who were coaching?
they were in their early teens. So
perfect. There you go. Well, Mark, we appreciate you joining us and wanted to get some insight from you. Walt Disney Company, Fortune 500, one of the most successful businesses out there today. You guys saw all this coming, right? And we're fully prepared for this new environment we're living in. Is that true?
absolutely. I mean, we were just incredibly receptive and we planned for this. And so when no one showed up, it was like, oh, we got this. So yeah, it was perfectly planned for.
So in reality, what is the Walt Disney Company experiencing right now from an employee turnover standpoint, retention? How's that working for you?
Yeah, so just to level set, Disney's an organization of, we're north of 200,000 employees, so big place. A lot of those individuals were in hourly positions at the parks, and many of those got furloughed. So we closed parks all over the globe. Not only parks, but a lot of the hotels that are associated with the parks. So, I mean, there was no playbook for this. And so, they were furloughed for extended period of time as we waited for the economy to come back. And many of those individuals couldn't wait. They had to go and take other jobs. Some of them did. And so we have hired an awful lot of them back. However, many of them who took different jobs, we had to move on. And so we're in a big hiring mode right now because we've got, as Dr. Ehrlich mentioned, we've got lots of openings that we need to fill. And so we're in a big hiring mode. I think Disney's has a good reputation as an employer, and as a result has seen some good success in bringing people to Orlando, Southern California, and the other 4 parks around the globe. But it's not easy. It's not easy. This is a really competitive environment. And even with the reputation that Disney enjoys, it's hard to get people to move at this point. So I can't overemphasize the importance of one thing. And I think that's a reputation that an individual or company has. And, Kara mentioned the importance of leadership, and leadership dictates the culture, and culture leads to your reputation. And so those things that seemingly are very intangible are very tangible.
Perfect. Thank you for that insight. So I wanted to shift gears and come to you, Ben, and just get your perspective, because you work with a few hundred employers around the country. You are on the ground with them all day fighting these battles. What are you seeing employers doing in an effort to attract and retain the current employees they have and get new ones to join? And specifically, can you talk to what you see them considering from a benefit standpoint?
Sure. So one thing that we've had a lot of conversation around with the employers across the country is the idea of mission-driven benefits, and that, delivering a benefit, first of all, it's not just medical, but it's a whole person viewpoint. But we really, it's not a renewal activity. It's a strategy of how do we reduce waste, because compensation and benefits are forever tied together. We cannot separate the two. So when we talk about all of the things, even up to this point in this webinar, those stats and those details are very important, because if we're wasting money in the benefits landscape, we can't redeploy those dollars in a more valuable way. So then we look at the alternative. How can we be more effective, and how can we consider our employees individually in our corporate benefits strategy? And we've all been trained that way. When you interact with Amazon, you're interacting with things that are about you as a person. And with Netflix, it interacts with you as a person. So when my daughters start looking at princess videos on Netflix, then that's what I start getting recommended in my Netflix feed. So everything is attuned to us as individuals and as family. So if we can make really wise decisions within how we approach the benefit space, not only are we making a better deliverable for our workforce, which makes them feel as they're individually part of our culture, but we're actually able to free up cash that we can start using for those things like Kara mentioned. If our hardware and software is behind, if we can free up cash, maybe the employer can deploy and reinvest in the business in a more valuable way, and many other examples like that.
Thank you, Ben. And Kara, your reference to the gas prices really kind of struck home in a humorous way for me. And I know this is a serious topic, but I saw somebody post on Facebook recently that these $3.89 gas prices are like GPAs, and it's summa cum laude pricing, and we need some academic probation pricing, and that's what these people are facing. You know, Gabe, I'd like to get your take on this. We had a question submitted actually by one of our attendees that I think is very relevant, and I'm not sure if you have any insight into it or not, but there has been a moratorium on evictions, on foreclosures, and that's going to be coming to an end here soon. And with what we're also experiencing from a housing price standpoint, do you anticipate the lower end of the income spectrum is going to see a significant issue and a lot of pressure from a housing standpoint moving forward?
Yeah, and I saw this question. I don't trust myself with technology well enough to try to answer these things on the fly. So the first point is, we're all kind of waiting nervously to see what happens with the end of the forbearance and the moratoria. Well, economists are notoriously terrible at predicting house prices. But if you would have told me that we would see prices do what they've done during the pandemic, I would have said, what are you talking about? One thing to point out is, so just to give you my forecast first, we expect price appreciation to slow down quite a bit as the moratoria end, but we're not expecting a crash in prices. So we don't expect prices actually to start falling in an appreciable way. We're really expecting a return to more normal, moderate levels of appreciation. And one reason to kind of back up that assessment is, look, a lot of what we think has driven the increase in prices is the fall in mortgage rates. Interest rates have fallen quite a bit during the pandemic. The market seems to expect that interest rates are going to remain low for a long time. Mortgage rates are low. That means that even with a higher sticker price, your mortgage payment might not be going up the same way that the price has gone up. That's not to say it can still create really substantial problems, because you need a down payment, right? And so it can be harder to save for a down payment. There are definitely distributional aspects of this. So what we see is, listen, that is clearly, as we start seeing foreclosures, we start seeing forbearance, that is going to be start slowing down what we've seen in the housing market. But right now inventory levels are rock bottom. And like I say, the big fundamental is the interest rates. That's low. Another thing to say is demographics are supporting the housing market now. I did a lot of work as a housing economist earlier in my career, so tell me when to shut up, Mike. But one thing to say is, look, the millennials are really getting into prime house buying years now.
Yeah. If I could chime in there, from an employer standpoint, though, I am seeing if you employ lower wage workers, even lower wage, professional workers, but early career, right? Early earners in their career. I'm seeing a lot of folks who are renting getting displaced because the rent is either getting so high, or if they are renting a home, for example, it's getting sold out from under them because the owner is saying it's a seller's market. So get out of my house because I'm going to sell it to somebody who has better credit and can afford it or has a down payment ready to go. So just be prepared that is a reality. A lot of our lower earning, whether it's lower wages or just early career people that can't afford nice houses yet, they are really in a tough spot financially.
Perfect. Thank you for that. So this, going back to the initial poll question, it was about 70-30, that 70% of the folks attending today have seen an uptick in employee turnover. So unsurprisingly, that aligns with what we're hearing anecdotally, and Gabe was able to see in his data as well. I'd like to bring up another poll question. This one's specifically around which strategies do you as attendees believe might be the most effective to reduce employee turnover? And there's dozens we could put on this list, but what we're looking for is trying to narrow it down, and then we'd like to get some feedback from both Kara, Ben, and Mark in terms of things that maybe, Ben, you as CEO of Connor Insurance have implemented since the pandemic as a way to continue to make your place a place that people want to stay. Kara, what are you seeing clients doing? And Mark, can you speak to any particular strategies that you've implemented or the Walt Disney Company has implemented recently that are new as attempts to keep people around, or double down on certain strategies to keep people around? So we'll give it about 15 more seconds on this poll, and we'll reference that when it comes up. But Mark, we'll start with you. If you can talk to anything that might be you've either doubled down on or that you're seeing that's new that you weren't doing before as a company.
Sure. I think Kara will echo this. There's an age-old adage that says people don't leave companies, they leave bosses. And I think we double down on that notion that, the most important connection that any individual has to an organization is with their leader. And if that leader is someone they identify with, that feels like they support them, if they feel like they've got an open environment to have conversations, if they feel like they're invested in their development, then you're going to take a lot of the things that are related to compensation and somebody trying to pull someone out of your organization off the table. And so I personally believe that great organizations are comprised of great supervisors. So what is a great supervisor? That supervisor is someone who does those things that are intangible, that are investments in others. And people often want to take, I think, a formulaic approach to all of this. And I think it boils down to a lot of things that are just essence of leadership. By the way, you hear my coworker there in the background. Sorry about that. But that's an age-old strategy that I think works. And we've talked a lot about compensation. I think you have to pay people enough to take compensation off the table. And that's a Dan Pink perspective. I think you've got to pay people appropriately, but beyond that, you can't overemphasize pay. And I think people tend to go to the pay card as quickly as possible. And so investment in leadership, and then to the point that I think Ben made earlier about things that may be a little bit more current and unique in terms of, how are we as employees addressing the whole person? And we've got this thing right now. Are you forcing people back into the office? Do they have to work together? And I think there's some rationale for saying, yeah, we need to be together, but are you going to mandate that people come back to the office? And that's a point of conversation with people. And that's an example of what may now be a benefit in people's minds that they don't want to lose. And so how do you address that? How do you address it with them, in a proactive conversation?
Kara, do you care to add anything to that?
Oh, absolutely. It didn't surprise me that 31% of the folks who just responded to that said they are trying to hire better candidates. because I keep hearing that. Well, if we just hire better people, we won't have this problem. And I would like to respectfully push back on that approach, because I believe we should look inward first. I believe that better retention of people, which comes from investing in your leaders, properly onboarding and training folks, building the team for better camaraderie. I believe that the better retention is your best recruiting strategy ever. So the moment that we say, oh, it's you, not me. No, I just need to hire better yous, but nothing's wrong with me, then we get ourselves in trouble. So if we look in the mirror first and again say, how can we be more attractive? How can we be a better place to work? That's when you start to get more employee referrals, and which is a much easier and cheaper recruiting strategy than going to find people who don't even know you. So definitely focusing more on the internal things that we can do better. And we have found a lot of companies now are doing pulse surveys. So not just annual one-time surveys, but regular 1 or 2 questions out to different pockets of the employees to collect more valid data. And then much more effective and intentional onboarding, because we cut down to just compliance, check the box, we got to get them on the floor. And now we need to reinstate proper onboarding that includes our culture and who we are and what we expect, communicate our expectations. Because I'll tell you right now, your new hires cannot read your mind. And at my first job, nobody told me I had to keep my shoes on all day. Nobody told me that. It wasn't in the handbook or covered during orientation or anything. And so it took somebody actually communicating that. I know you're thinking that's just common sense, but it wasn't, because we were in a carpeted, non-OSHA regulated environment. And I didn't think it was a big deal to walk to the copier barefoot. So keep that in mind, that we need stronger onboarding, stronger managers, and more than anything, communicating what those expectations are explicitly.
Ben, as a CEO of an organization with about 40 employees, what have you done as the leader, the chief at the top, to try to stem the potential tide? We're in a very competitive industry, both you and I, in terms of there's not a lot of people that want to do what we do. And so when you have a good one, you got to keep them. What are you doing to make that happen?
Yeah, I think ultimately the baseline is we pursue relationships and we pursue people. And, they say, you could have 2 totally different ideas, but they both can be true at the same time. So for an example, we needed to be flexible and embrace how our organization can be nimble and use technology to our advantage, where people didn't necessarily have to be in the office, but they were certainly efficient, at home, just as they are here. But not everyone's situation is that way. You have people like myself who has 3 kids, 4 and under. That work from home environment isn't necessarily conducive for success. And then you had other people dealing with e-learning. You had others that maybe were married with no kids, or single, or single with kids. I mean, you had so many different environments that we had to pursue people individually and make sure that we were supporting them purposefully. But on the other hand, it would have been really easy to stay in this 2D Brady Bunch life where we're, in our box on the screen. But that's not part of our organization's DNA. Our DNA is about creating meaningful relationships internally in the office and about doing meaningful and challenging work. So we were very intentional, obviously in a safe way, of getting people back together in the office for collaboration and that sort of thing, and being really transparent about why that matters, about how we were going to do that safely, and giving safe space for people to let us know if they were comfortable or not, and then make the proper adjustments. But it was all about pursuing people. And I think that was the hard way. It would have been so easy to just say, stay at home, we'll figure it out later, we'll punt until someone else goes first. But that just wasn't what we were about.
Thank you for that. And Dr. Ehrlich, I see you doing a lot of nodding. This is going a little off topic in terms of your area of expertise, but for you personally, and what are you seeing the university doing? Anything new, and what challenges are you experiencing at the research seminar, keeping people around and making sure that everybody wants to stay there?
Yeah, we're obviously in a little bit of a different environment being at the university. In terms of coming back into the office, we're in a building that has student classrooms, right? And so, it's a very different dynamic with the students. There's a lot of trepidation, about what the fall semester is going to look like. We're optimistic. This is actually the first day now that kind of staff can come back into the office without jumping through a lot of hoops. So I'm actually still at home this morning. It's been a long time. I really took Ben's point about the 2D boxes. I mean, it's been a lot of that. At the same time, you do see in the data and in the surveys, a lot of people really do value the option to work at home, and it is part. It's going to be here to stay, I think. And what I took from Ben's remarks is being intentional about finding the right balance between working from home and coming into the office, and that you do want that in-person interaction to create those meaningful relationships and to knowledge transfer. We've had some onboarding during the pandemic. It's been tougher. It's been tougher than it was before the pandemic. You can't just show someone your screen as easily, and you don't get those unplanned, spontaneous meetings and interactions and just be able to drop by somebody's office. What the surveys show is that workers really do value, and this is, like you say, Mike, a little bit outside of my expertise, but workers seem to really value the ability to work from home sometimes. The best estimates I've seen are that about 20% of work is going to kind of stay remote, whether that's people working 1 day a week, or whether, there are some people who are going to basically be at home, I think, permanently. And then, of course, there are some jobs you can't do from home, right? But when you average it out across the economy, it looks like about 20% is the best guess of how much work is going to stay remote going forward.
Perfect. So I want to bring up a slightly outside the box and maybe vulnerable poll question for everybody to respond to. Ben and I were just together at a seminar with some of our peers from around the country in Indianapolis last week. And one of the speakers that came in said something that really struck me. So I'd like to bring up our poll question about very simple yes or no. Are those that are attending today, are you burned out? And it's the folks that are attending here are leaders, whether HR leaders, C-suite leaders, leaders in their respective departments. I'm just curious to find out what the audience says. I'm burned out. Yes, I'm burned out. And I'm going to make this relevant to the conversation once we see the results. And as we wait for the final results to come in, the reason I bring this up, and I'd look for all of our panelists to weigh in on this, is that we were all doing our jobs and doing them at a relatively high level, and then the pandemic hit, and it was day-to-day, hand-to-hand combat. We got to get through this thing. And then we kind of got our way through it. And then all of a sudden it's supposed to be back to business as usual, when you never really had a chance to kind of turn around and look and see like, what just happened? And so looks about 2/3 of the audience here are burned out personally. And so I want to bring this up because, number one, want to encourage you to persevere, because Gabe's information showed us a little bit that normal might actually come back here sooner than later to some degree. But I'd like for everybody to weigh in. Mark, I'd like to start with you. What are you doing to keep your leaders engaged who might be burned out? How are you acknowledging what it was that they just went through, and also encouraging that they listen, it's not time to take our foot off the gas, and talk a little bit about that, and then we'll go around and look for everybody else to weigh in as well.
Yeah, Mike, I think that at the beginning, there's an acknowledgement that what we've experienced is significant. So we've talked a lot about the pandemic. We've not talked a lot about the social issues that have affected us all. We've all gone through a relatively contentious election, and the aftermath of that we saw things in Washington many of us never would have expected to see in our lifetimes. To me, it feels a little bit like we're living through this discontinuous change that is just, it takes a tremendous amount of energy. So we've all experienced this phenomenon where you drive somewhere, you get there, and you realize that you were thinking about something else, and you sort of put it on autopilot as you were driving. And, how did I get here? I don't really know how I got here. And so you were able to divert energy from a normal activity because you knew what it felt like, you knew what to do, you knew where to turn, to something that maybe was capturing your mind's eye at the point. So right now we're all intently focused on a lot of change. Things are being done differently today. And whenever any of us encounter change, it takes a lot of energy. And the thing is, it's not just in our work lives, it's in our personal lives as well. And so for us, the acknowledgement that everything we've experienced is sort of abnormal is the first thing you do, and say, if you're feeling tired, if you're feeling spent, you're not alone. And I think people have a tendency right now to think that they're an N of one. And boy, I'm weird because I'm feeling this and nobody else is. And so you've got to level set with people and say, hey, if you're feeling this, you're not alone. And, it's important for us to just pause. And we've got an aggressive agenda. I get that. But let's take a minute and say, we need to make sure we're all in a good spot mentally, physically. And so we're going to postpone this topic or that discussion. It doesn't have to happen today. It can happen tomorrow, next week. And so I don't want to say we've taken our foot off the gas, because I think that's not exactly what's happened. But I think we've also, at the same time, we've been a little bit more careful about when we put the gas pedal down. And so I think you just have to stay, aware of your circumstances.
So, Kara, thank you for those comments, Mark. And Kara, I'd like to get your take. So as you're advising leaders, either in the HR department or C-suite individuals, what are you suggesting to them, or what are you hearing and what do you suggest? And the challenge is, ultimately, if you're at the top, it's a lonely place to be and you just gotta put your head down and keep going. But as you start working your way down the food chain to some degree, what are you saying to those folks on how they can keep those folks that are working beneath them, those managers, how are they keeping them motivated and acknowledging what it was that they may be feeling?
Yeah, I echo everything Mark said. Thank you for sharing that. I personally, with a 6-year-old at home who did kindergarten half virtual and half in person with a mask this past year, I had what I would consider decision fatigue. And I still have it today. Remember when we were wiping down groceries? Like, should I wipe them down? I don't know. Should I? Is it okay not to? And now I still wonder, should my kiddo only play outside with friends because they're still young and not vaccinated? Or is it okay if I let him in a house with a friend? Should I have a friend over for a sleepover? I mean, we're still just all these decisions that would have been no big deal in the past. It is extra brain power that we are putting in. Even if you don't have children, there's still other decisions. I'm going to lunch with a friend. Should I wear a mask or not? Should I, little things like that we have 100 more decisions a day that we didn't have before. And I just spoke at 2 different conferences and it was amazing. One of them, they were very, wow, we've been through a lot, but let's go stronger forward and let's get back to business. And they barely even acknowledged that we had a devastating year. I mean, and it was actually the speakers convention, which you can imagine the speakers and trainer world collapsed from underneath us last year. I mean, it was devastating, just like hospitality, right, Mark? I mean, I feel you. That was horrific for that particular industry. And they just went on like nothing, almost nothing happened. Like, hey, we survived, we're good, let's move on with strategies. Then I went to a healthcare client or conference to speak. And they started the conference with the most amazing activity that I just wanted to quickly share with you. They asked 4 questions and they gave us time. They gave us about 30 seconds to a minute for every question. 1, what have you lost in the last 18 months? Personally and professionally. They gave us space to go there, right? 2, what have you gained in the last 18 months? And they gave us space to go there. The 3rd, how have you tried to come across during this time, right? The strength you're putting forward for family, friends, workers, whatever, right? And then the 4th was, how are you really feeling on the inside at this moment. And I've got goosebumps now because I will tell you, I was crying and I was the keynoter right after that guy. So I was like so upset because he made me cry. But it is what it is, right? But it was just beautiful because they started the conference with that conversation and that space for people to talk about it. He actually had us crumple our papers and throw them in the aisle. And then he picked up 5 randomly and read it, to Mark's point, to prove you are not alone. And the things that people were saying were individual, but still a collective grieving, that we've been going through and whatnot. So as a strategy, I just encourage you to give your folks the time to grieve or the space to even process what we have just been through and are still to this day going through right now.
Kara, that's incredible insight. And just to recap for everybody, what did you lose? What did you gain? How did you put yourself forward? And then how are you actually feeling inside? What I'd like to just get some Ben's thoughts on this, and then I've got one other question, and then we'll wrap it up with some closing remarks from everyone. Ben, to the point about being burned out, what have you heard as a leader? Are you yourself burned out as a leader, and how are you continuing to support those that you need to stay engaged and want to keep moving forward?
Yeah, and I think even to go back to Mark's point where he was kind of saying, well, it's not like we're not going full speed or have our gas on the pedal, but the reality is you don't go full throttle through the corners or the pits, right? There are moments in business where you have to change. You have to change pace. You have to change your speed, and maybe you have to slow down and stop. And I think that's just maybe just a really critical analogy of just how you endure the long race, because I believe Simon Sinek is talking about the infinite game, where it's not something that, we're solving for the quarter, which I'm sure for a lot of businesses, the quarters matter, but there's a long game to this. So, quite simply, inside of the long game, there's just a couple things that I think really matter in interactions with our workforce. And, with our team, it's, to Mark's point, there's a lot going on professionally and personally. Kara mentioned that. That was fantastic story. And I can't imagine being the keynote after that. But the reality is, what can we control? And out of all of these things, that answer could be very little. So let's just focus on that. So we can control maybe some tactics that we do. We can control our attitudes as well. So let's just stay there. And then also just give ourselves time to step away. Kara just mentioned she was at a conference. Mike, you and I were just at a conference. Those are just such valuable times to step away and really think differently about what we're doing, which can be exhausting a little bit, but it also recharges us. It allows us to do different things. And as Mark mentioned, I was a coach a few years ago, and I always found it really odd that we try to force kids to play a certain sport all year round, because I thought that it was always interesting when kids stepped away and did a different sport, how one, they came back more energized and ready for the sport that we were involved with, which was basketball. And another thing is they learned a lot of really good things when they played soccer or volleyball or whatever it may be, that transitions to what we're trying to do. And I think that really is a lesson that we can take to our workforce as well.
Perfect. So I've got one more question, and then we'll wrap it up with some closing remarks. I just wanted to also mention that something that Natasha Black put in the comments as well, that she's working to advocate to put in an EAP, an employee assistance program within their business to help employees with the challenges that they may be facing. We've seen from a benefit consultant standpoint, a number of our clients implement virtual mental health solutions. And here's a little tidbit or a loophole that the clock is somewhat ticking on this, but what the government allowed even HSA plans to do was cover certain things, virtual visits, for example, at 100%. and that's through the end of 2022, depending upon when your plan starts. So we've had employers that have solely HSA plan offerings, health savings account plan offerings, implement a virtual mental health solution at no cost to the members. And they can do that and not run afoul of HSA issues because of that current loophole that we have. So that's a huge thing. And so just want to kind of take that note and flip it to one last thought. And look for all of you to weigh in on this. You know, when I got married, the coaching that I got as a very ignorant young man was that you need to continue dating your wife. Once you get married, it's not game over, it's just getting started. And we've talked about this in our preparations for this, that you need to keep dating your employees. And I think, Kara, what you just shared with us, those 4 questions would be a great way to figure out what your employees are looking for and how to date them better. But Mark, you also touched on making sure that you as an organization are really front and center, more so than ever, with your culture, living out the stuff that you put on that mission and vision and values. So can you talk a little bit about, Mark, how Walt Disney Company continues to date employees? And then Gabe, I'd like for you to weigh in too and just offer your insight and what you're seeing at the university and what you as a leader of your particular organization are doing. We'll go to you, Kara, and then Ben, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, so I would say that the events of 2020 were profoundly important for the Walt Disney Company to not just reaffirm, but really truly understand the values that we hold as an organization. And part of why that is so critical is in times of turmoil and unrest and uncertainty, you want to go back to those statements about who are we? And it's in that set of principles that you find strength and stability. And the definition of how they may manifest today can look different. And I think all of us in leadership roles have to continue to reinterpret what things might mean. But to go back and to find that bedrock is absolutely critical. And so if you haven't spent time on your organization's values, what you stand for, who you are, then I think it's a great investment of time. And to the point we've sort of talked about over and over again, it lets people exhale, because we want to wander into things at times that maybe we shouldn't. And it gives us a sense of boundaries. And, you know, I'm a big advocate for people taking a pause, as several of us have mentioned, and zooming out. It's probably my favorite phrase of the last couple of years, and seeing the big picture, because we're pulled in constantly, whether it's, you know, an issue, a fire, a social media, you know, blast of some kind. We get pulled into the urgent, and we need to zoom out. And, you know, Ben, I'll go back to, well, Mike, you're the one who mentioned marriage counseling, I guess. And when my wife and I were married, the advice we got was, if you can remember one thing, you'll have a long and happy marriage. And that is, there are 2 types of problems in this world: small problems and small problems that look like big problems. And funny enough, that kind of works at times. You know, we overemphasize and amplify things that don't need amplification. And it's that zooming out that lets us see, wait a minute, that's not a huge deal. We can handle that. Let's do that.
Thank you for those comments, Mark. Gabe, any thoughts on this particular topic? And it's a kind of a wide-ranging topic, but any thoughts that you personally or you as an organization are working on to continue to date your team members?
You know, Mike, I guess I love that phrase, and I got a kick out of in the preparation. I told my wife afterwards that you said that about you got to keep dating your wife. Shit, you're raising expectations for me, Mike. But I just wanted to say, you know, I really appreciated and loved hearing, you know, this discussion, because it's so far outside of what I typically do. You know, can we put it in a graph? If we can't put it in a graph, it's out, right? In my world. So it's, you know, it's really insightful and important. And one thing I do want to say as an economist, you know, when you look at the numbers and something I've actually looked, you know, in the data, organizations that look quite similar. So they're paying about the same. They employ employees who look about the same in terms of what you can see in the data. They're in the same industries. they have very different outcomes in terms of, do they keep people? How high is turnover? That sort of thing. There's lots of what we call heterogeneity in the data. And, I think that this conversation really points to, okay, why do organizations get really different outcomes, right? At least as far as we can see in the hard numbers, right? And this focus on values, on making sure that, that there's a community and a sense of camaraderie in an organization, I think has to be a big part of that. So it's been a really interesting discussion.
Thank you for that, Gabe. Kara, thoughts?
Sure. So to Mark's point about knowing your values, I think that is huge. And please do not stop at, we have our core values, they're up on all the walls, because what's up on the wall isn't always what's walking down the hall, as we say. So your actual culture is how people are being treated and how those managers and supervisors and team members are talking to each other. That's the real culture of the workplace every day, whether it's remote or all together or whatnot. So yes, identify those core values, work to live them out, not just put them up on posters. And then also we encourage groups to have, no matter how large you are, right? I work with some large and some very small organizations. You really need to have a team of folks, or at least a part-time person that is focused on retention, that is a retention specialist or strategist or a retention task force. Because if we just put that on HR's plate, then they don't have time to listen. They're dealing with all the recruiting and all the benefits and, comp analysis and other things like that. So I think if we're talking about dating our employees, a big part of that is listen to them. So if you have this specialist and or task force that really gathers the true data, not just exit interviews, what people are saying, but does more genuine check-ins, better stay interviews, more pulse surveys, and then starts working on what are advancement opportunities that are creative and what, they can be involved in the compensation and other conversations and whatnot. I think listening is how you date and improve those relationships more. So it's really through a specialist. We actually have a sample job description because folks said, what would that look like? So if you want the sample job description, just reach out to me on LinkedIn or whatnot, and I'll get that to you because it is certainly a full-time job. It can be at almost any organization.
Thank you, Kara. That's the first time I've heard that suggestion. That's a great takeaway for sure. Ben, any thoughts on continuing to date your employees?
Yeah, I think what Kara mentioned just now is critical. And quite frankly, it is what's provided a lot of success internally as we've really have invested in our culture, which is baseline from mission and values, but it's a team. It is a collection of individuals within our company that obviously it's headed up by our HR director, but out of 40 employees, we have 15 people that are doing the work to make sure that our culture is cared for. And that it is it's just so much, and we certainly couldn't do it without the entire team, and they've been incredibly creative and creating those opportunities for meaningful engagement, and that really has been everything. Another thing I've been really just reflective on in this conversation, and even as we've prepped for this, is this is complicated. I mean, all of the data from Gabe and hearing Mark and Kara and their stories, data and people, that is difficult. So I guess from my perspective, it's just keep your feet moving, right? It's not going to be perfect. So let's just take action and then continuously improve, with our values as the baseline.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Ben. Someone just paused the question, what was the results of the last poll? And going from memory, it was about upper 60s burned out, lower 30s not. And we'll send all the poll responses out to everybody that was in attendance today that joined us. So you have all offered great insight. I appreciate you all being a part of this. I'll give you all a chance if you want to just offer any closing thoughts before we wrap up.
I'm happy to start. I think that we have a tendency in these moments to make blanket sort of decisions that apply to everybody and everything. I think it's really important as we talk about employees and retention that you treat people individually, and you never lose lose sight of the fact that every person in your organization is an individual with unique needs. They can't meet 100% of those needs all the time. I get that. But to the extent that you treat each person as an individual, that will translate into a sense of respect. And to me, if a person feels respected by their employer, by the people they work with, they are more than likely to want to stay in that organization.
Thank you, Mark. Gabe, any closing thoughts for us?
Thanks, Mike. Just first thing is, this has been a great event and discussion, so thanks for organizing it and having me. Second, just to kind of end with, okay, what is the outlook if I had to sum it up? Think about the 2018, 2019 economy. That really is the new normal we're going to get. Look, some things in the economy are going to be changed forever. We don't know exactly what the new normal is going to look like, but think about a tight economy. Think about a labor market, where workers have options. That's kind of where we seem to be headed back to. And we expect, the next 5 years or so to look something like that. Of course, there are going to be bumps along the way, but don't think back to 2012 or 2011 when, you could post a job opening and you knew, wow, there's, 5 unemployed people for every job opening. That's not the world we're living in anymore. So people just need to have that in mind.
Thank you, Dr. Ehrlich. Appreciate your insight very much. Kara.
I would love to give folks that are in or are headed into senior leadership a bit of warning. I have recently become emotional intelligence certified, and I'm learning more about this and really like nerding out about the data about emotional intelligence. And what it shows is that when you go into management and supervisor positions, your emotional intelligence grows of how you can read the room and understand your people. But then the higher up you go after middle management, once you become a director, a vice president, owner, or CEO, your EQ actually tends to drop off at that point because of what I talked about early, which was that disconnect from the front line. So I just want to make sure that we all stay connected, listen. The one size no longer fits all. So just like Mark said, individuals, focus on the individuals. No longer can we do blanket strategies and whatnot, and just keep your finger on the pulse, because you can quickly get kind of out of touch unknowingly, not on purpose. No one wants to do that. But if we sit behind spreadsheets and inboxes for too long, we forget who our people really are. We can kind of lose sight of that. So stay in touch with your people and really keep getting to know them, keep dating them, keep listening.
Thank you, Kara. So Ben is my co-host. I'm going to let you close. And so I just want to say thank you to everyone here today and appreciate your insight. And it's a tough nut to crack, but we're all in it together. And to whatever degree any of us can help, any that attended today, I know that offer's out there. So Ben, let's get some closing thoughts from you.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us. I'd like to thank our panelists for spending time and to deliver such wonderful, wise nuggets for us. Mike, thank you for being a wonderful partner in this and really driving this discussion. When I think about what we're doing from an employee benefits perspective, it's a microcosm of this bigger picture that we just talked about. And the one thing that kind of summarizes, I feel like, what we've been talking about is courage. It just takes courage to move forward and do things a little bit differently, and to rethink how we're delivering value to our employees in a more individualized fashion. So I just want to encourage everybody to have courage, and just want to thank everyone for joining us on this Monday.
Thank
See you all.